Maurice Newman, thanks for joining us. I wanted to look at this issue of shareholder democracy and the changes in investments on our share markets that Janet Albrechtsen wrote about earlier this week. I thought, who better to talk to than a former chairman of the Australian Stock Exchange yourself. Are you concerned about the extent to which investments are now going to private equity funds, privately held funds, rather than through listed companies on the share market?
Well, Chris, I think that Janet Albrechtsen put her finger right on it. What is happening is that more and more companies are deciding to go to private equity rather than face all of the laws and the regulations they have to face as a publicly listed company, together with the fact that more and more funds which used to be in individual hands are now being pooled in our superannuations. And so it is a combination of factors where, when I was chairman of the exchange, say from the early 90s through to, say, the mid-noughties, we used to rejoice in the fact of people's capitalism. But I think more and more individual shareholders are now going to the pooled funds. And in addition to that, the additional regulations that people have to face means, and there was a Canadian survey on this not so long ago, which showed in 2018 the number of early startups is in decline.
What are the implications of this for small shareholders, those many people in the Australian economy who perhaps only own shares through their superannuation funds, and therefore they're locked into mainly listed companies on the share market? Are they likely to get lower returns compared to perhaps the less encumbered private equity funds that are sort of doubling the share market growth in recent years?
Well, that's a possibility, but when you consider the fact that if you've got funds in a superannuation fund, well, in that case, of course, it's almost done by remote control, and until you get your annual or half-yearly reports, you don't know how you're going. But what I'm saying is that I think one of the great strengths of our society going back 30 years is that people actually own shares. They had a slice of the business and they took an interest in the way in which business worked. So we're going to lose that. And what's more, because you have fewer and fewer participants in the stock market, the risk is it becomes increasingly volatile. And that's not a good thing either.
Yeah, so you don't have people having that direct connection to a company, to their investment, which obviously is a problem also when it comes to the way companies operate, because those big superannuation funds can be very activist in the way they try and encourage companies to adopt particular political positions, for instance, and largely through these corporate social responsibility goals.
Yeah. That is absolutely true, and the large funds, particularly the industry or union-run funds, are becoming more and more politically active and have agendas which they run. And those agendas aren't necessarily in the best interests of the shareholders and the members that the trustees of those funds represent.
How big is this problem? How onerous are the rules that are being applied not just from within companies, but also rules enforced upon them by the stock exchange to actually aspire to these corporate social responsibility goals above and beyond their own profit and loss goals?
You know, it reminds me, Chris, that when Adolf Hitler, I know this sounds like a long bow, but when Adolf Hitler came to office in 1933, what happened in Germany was exactly the sort of thing that is happening with our companies now. They were talking then about corporate social responsibility, how the directors had at least as much, if not more, obligation to the community at large than they did to their shareholders, and sometimes profits had to be sacrificed in the greater good. And that's the sort of message which is coming through. And you can say that this is alarmist, but I think it is a very unhealthy development. What we're seeing is a growing number of new generation directors who are into virtue signalling, who are into doing all the so-called politically correct right thing. And this is ultimately to the detriment of risk-taking and long-term returns for not only the company concerned, but also the overall economy.
Well, it's always a risk in any public debate to invoke anything that happened in Germany in the 1930s, but essentially you're saying...
Well, it is, but I just think the parallels are there, and I'm not suggesting that this is being run by some Hitler somewhere. I'm simply saying that the philosophy is no different. And if you see where all of that ultimately led, I think we need to at least be alert to it.
Yeah, and the point is what it does to the performance of the share market and therefore the performance of individuals' in investments. And is this why we're seeing private equity funds grow more strongly than the share market? Because the share market is encumbered by all these rules and all these social goals.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. And as Janet pointed out in her article, it's not any longer the exit going to the stock market. Sometimes it's sold to another private equity firm or to a trade. It's a trade sale. And so individual investors are precluded from participating.
So what's the answer to this? How can this be improved? How can you encourage more individual investors to invest directly in the share market, take an interest in the companies that they're investing in and make sure those companies are focused on their products or services rather than meeting some sustainability goals or perhaps even global sustainable development goals and the like that they all seem to want to bow to?
Well, it becomes very difficult to wind this back. And when you think that we just had a Hayne Royal Commission into banking, where the regulators were shown to be not only asleep at the wheel, but in many cases incompetent, what do? But we give them even more authority. So I don't see any salvation there. It needs a complete mindset change to move away from the groupthink that we need to pool our resources and to think about individuals having more control over their lives.
And bottom line, just finally on this, Maurice, how important would significant reform of this be for the economy? Would it free up our economy, make us, many of these companies, more productive?
Well, it would. It would make the economy more streamlined, more productive. But of course, for every regulation, you'll find there's a supporter because it provides some form of protection one way or another. Tony Abbott tried to have what he called repeal days, but once he was removed from office, those repeal days stopped. So it's very, very difficult to regain the ground which has been lost over the last 20 to 30 years.
Maurice Newman, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you for asking me.